Marissa. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having us. So I'm going to share my screen, yeah? And then, or do we want to do introductions? Yes. Introductions first. Okay, so my name is Juan Narváez. I work at St. Francis Community Services, the Catholic Legal Assistance Ministry, which is our legal aid department. I work on the Immigrant Housing Justice Project. And so I'll just go on to Lauren.
I'm Lauren Verseman. I'm a staff attorney with EHOC, the Metropolitan St. Equal Housing and Opportunity Council. So we're a fair housing organization that works with people who believe they've been discriminated against in housing and lending and other housing related activities. And I'll pass it to Myisha then. If she's around, or if not, I'll pass it back to Juan Carlos.
Okay. I'll just go ahead and start sharing my screen. Share. Can people see that? No? Share. Oh, Myisha, there you are. Did you want to
take a break? But hi, everyone. My name is Myisha Johnson. I'm the Tenant Rights Coordinator with Dutchtown South Community Corporation. I'm also a member of State Street Tenant Resistance and Housing Defense Collective of St. Louis.
Yes, thank you, Myisha. I'm figuring this out. Wait, done, no. I'm sorry, everybody. Okay, does everybody see that? Okay, good. Okay, so we got introductions out of the way. Let's begin. Again, I'm the Immigrant Housing Justice Project organizer at St. Francis Community Services, and that's Myisha. And so, okay, before I start, I want to begin this session by doing a sort of mental exercise to challenge what we normally think as it relates to housing, and also a disclaimer that that this does not necessarily reflect the position of St. Francis Community Services on a lot of what I'm about to talk about. So it's just that we'll do this by rooting housing and housing justice work in a context in which they are situated within all struggles for liberation on occupied, colonized, and stolen lands on which American society was founded upon, and in movements all over the world, as well as that all of these struggles are interconnected to one another. The home is the focal point on which we frame the issues of our time. Either we are protecting it from external forces, making the decision of fleeing from it, and where we decide to have family and grow community. And also to challenge the belief that what we're told about these systems is the way it has to be, which means that housing is the logic of racial capitalism and white supremacy that undergird the financialization of housing, for example, gentrification, or the extraction of rent from low-income people. So why is housing important? It's the crossroads at which it meets structural racism and how housing interconnects with all struggles. You can see it in the following ways, like the US and carceral state. It's the militarization of police and the border, the police brutality, immigration detention and deportation, the over-policing of communities of color, which affects families by effectively disappearing them from the lives of their loved ones and the ability to participate in community. That also includes the immigrant community. And you can see it in the legacies of segregation and redlining, which still mark our cities and neighborhoods today. Education, a child's well-being can be affected by any eviction, and that transience that causes by moving from place to place, maybe even more than a year or less than a year of living in a place. Health disparities and life expectancy are largely dictated by zip codes. Poverty and the criminalization of poverty. Indigenous folks, not to completely just glaze over a whole people that were violently removed from their homes through genocide, but you can see that generational trauma and effects in a lot of Native American communities today. There's a lack of available housing and lack of public housing, and access to and lack of funds for public transportation. So it's not a housing crisis, it's a tenants' rights crisis. Making that crossroad connection is significant because they include all tenants. Those are anywhere from renters, the unhoused, children, the incarcerated, the employed, the unemployed, the harassed, the evicted, undocumented people, domestic violence survivors, or in other words, this is those people that are not in control of their housing. By calling it a housing crisis, it benefits those who design housing, who build it, and who profit from it, not the ones who actually live there. It encourages people to think in terms of values of properties, to speculate and calculate numbers and units, or about power over people, and it's not about the humans that live there. So where am I? Sorry. So Myisha and I were going to kind of be going in and out of each other. So Myisha, she's the Tenant Rights Coordinator. She's invaluable to the community. She provides so many resources, information. She does incredible outreach. She's out there on the ground. She knows what, she kind of has her ear to the community and what she's, you know, she does a lot. So Myisha, do you want to like,
oh, Juan, you make me feel so important.
well,
Well, I would like to start off with, I work with many entities within the community, but one major group of folks I work with is St. Anthony's Church, who has been working with a large group of immigrant and undocumented folks. The issue has been some of the resources that has been implemented into communities doesn't apply to them because they have no documentation to show that they are a citizen of the United States or even work or, you know, should deserve access to this, even though being human should allow them to have access to whatever resources that is out there to secure folks in their home right now during this pandemic. Some of the folks don't like to tell their story of the housing issues that they're facing due to the fact they don't want to look like a bad tenant to the landlord or to the individuals that may assist them. There is no such thing as a bad tenant, because if you are facing issues in your home, you should be able to speak about what those issues are and try to find a solution to it. Later on in this presentation, Juan will talk a little bit more about resources that could be allocated to the folks that are in need of housing resources.
okay. So thank you, Myisha. Sorry, I'm just, where was I? So yeah, experiences vary. You know, they can be very subtle. What we're seeing is that there have been a lot of issues of just harassment and threats to evict someone, and you know, they're just being intimidated for rent, sending people to collect their rent every month. It can range also from the very subtle, for example, when asking whether people have a court, when asking people whether they have a court date coming up, you know, some people's mind automatically goes to their immigration court date instead of, you know, a housing court date, for example, and to the not so subtle. So just as what I explained is, you know, if there's an attempt to illegally evict somebody because they are perceived not to know their rights, and that there's an eviction moratorium going on right now. They're told any story in order for people to vacate, or it can look like harassment and intimidation by sending henchmen, like I said. But you know, the vast majority of people, and the vast majority of people that I speak to, are really just do need rent. You know, they just need to have rent covered, especially right now with COVID cases are on the rise again, and people are talking about shutting down the city and the county, and so that's going to affect a lot of people that work in service industry, which is, you know, a large majority of the immigrant community. And at St. Francis Community Services, what we're mostly known for is offering social services, bilingual mental health therapy, and immigration legal services. About 60 to 75% of our clients are immigrants and or indigenous, at least just at our legal aid department. And indigenous in that they are coming from areas of Central America and in regions where they speak Hmong, Quechua, Anish, Chatino, but most do speak Spanish as their second language. These are folks that are facing persecution because they belong to a particular social group, like being indigenous, or because they are women and they are treated like property, or because their religion, political opinion, and these are classifications of people who are protected under asylum laws. And I think a central point here is that some immigrants, not all coming to America, was to be able to escape from life that they were living, not out of material motivation or desires, but out of necessity, out of survival, out of sacrifice, from fear of persecution or forced displacement from their homes, only to have that happen here. And so a lot of people can be re-traumatized as it relates to emotional stress, mental health problems, that evictions or threats from a landlord do cause on an individual level across all demographics. And on top of that, we're living through a period where the most restrictive immigration policies were put into place by the outgoing administration, and there's still a raging pandemic going on. So this is kind of a mindset of survival and sacrifice and scarcity. This also affects options to access safe, habitable housing, which is severely limited because people might be undocumented, or even immigrants with status. People might think that where they live is much better than where they came from, or where they come from. This relates to people's housing options. Even if people who live in basements or garages, they make that decision because they are coming from a mindset of survival. Despite the fact that their living conditions are untenable and pose habitability questions. It's not only survival, but people that come to the US might think that it's not for nothing that they left their home. People made that decision not because they necessarily wanted to, or that it was solely an economic one, but because they had to, and people are driven to make it work, no matter what. It's that sacrifice that you can hear in their voice. And so as much as you tell tenants that, you know, your landlord has to do this and that, you know, or you don't have to accept those conditions, you can ask to repair that. It's the mindset overlaid by fear and uncertainty, and considering the alternative of where they come from and their faith that everything will work out. There's a strong resiliency and resourcefulness that especially the immigrant community find a way to make it work. And beyond just housing, there exists an informal economy in which folks live and operate in, which is also largely cash-based. People who are unbanked, the use of alternative financial services like money orders to pay bills or money wire services. And that really highlights the underground housing market that might exist as well, where maybe a friend of a friend is referring to someone who has a house, or they're looking for housing on Facebook Marketplace. And so there's no real way to really find housing. How the COVID-19 health crisis has exacerbated cracks in the system. I include this because housing, it's all interconnected. And so you imagine yourself at home, sick, wondering if you have COVID, for example, and you want info on where you can go that isn't just Facebook or a friend. And you also want something to find local information, and that's in your language. But this also highlights the disparities in our society. It's not new to anybody that the virus has been concentrated in communities of color. And even in St. Louis County, at least, that Latinos were found to have gotten sick with COVID at 3 to 5 times the rate than other demographic groups. And that's a structural issue, because maybe there wasn't info that was being disseminated in our region's top languages, or even enough local government prioritized that enough to put effort into doing outreach. And that's why I include language access issues, and in particular the COVID hotlines, which at the beginning of the pandemic I called and tested in Spanish. And I called the statewide hotline and the local hospitals and the city government, St. Louis City hotline, and going to be honest that they didn't do that great when trying to connect with the language line. Which brings me to courts and access to justice. And Lauren might speak a little bit more to it, but both the county and city courts are holding over the phone or video conference court hearings and trials. What that means is that people are still receiving judgments against them on a platform that is not easily accessible for a lot of low-income people who lack internet connectivity, which raises due process concerns. And you throw in the language barrier. The courts must provide an interpreter for litigants that are limited English proficiency and non-English speaking. There have been incidences where litigants have not been afforded or provided an interpreter. It's also the perception of not qualifying because of immigration status, as it relates to the CDC national eviction order, I think, which Lauren will speak to it at length. It's true and this is true for all tenants, that most do not know about the CDC order, and the landlord is not required to tell tenants about it. And it is not an automatic application of protection. So, the tenant has to actively give a handwritten or a signed declaration saying that, they qualify under the CDC National Order Eviction Moratorium. A lot of immigrants perceive that they do not qualify for any assistance from nonprofit organizations, and especially from the government. And so they may not look for assistance with them. A requirement of the CDC orders, renters must make every best effort to apply for governmental assistance, which is burdensome on the tenant. In public charge, some may believe that even if you get assistance, it could put you at risk of whether someone applying for status will rely on public benefits in the future. And on the larger systemic level, there is a language barrier, which is often the primary reason why folks do not seek out help from government, healthcare, and other nonprofits. Only speaking English and not offering cultural and linguistic competent services can be intimidating and turn people off from looking for assistance with an organization or institution. But on the organizational level, it's that chicken or egg question. It begs the question whether it's that an organization does not offer language support or have bilingual staff because limited English proficient people, non-English speakers, do not request services, or is it because the organizations do not offer help and by extension are not able to highlight what is needed in the community? I'll move on. So illegal evictions right now is a major concern across the board for any marginalized and low-income community right now, even before the pandemic. This crime is often not enforced by the St. Louis City Police, citing that it is a civil matter and not a criminal one. And so the police will not do much when this is called in. And even when you want to make a report for an attempted illegal lockout, that can be difficult because an officer who calls back to finish the police report will hang up on the caller if they do not speak English, which has happened before. It's really difficult to say how often this happens, except from an increase in media stories that talks about illegal evictions, and there is no hard data on the rates of illegal evictions. Self-evictions, which leads me to self-evictions, is a situation where people may decide leave on their own, because it's a better choice than to live somewhere where they are being continually harassed or threatened with eviction by the landlord. And we suspect that this occurs at a much higher rate than actual legal evictions. And in this situation, the landlord wins because they ultimately get what they want for a tenant to get out. And for the tenant, this might be better than having an eviction on their record. Landlords, who have been harassing, intimidating, that is, we've been seeing a lot of increase in that, and unresponsiveness to repair requests, especially, if they're retaliating against tenants who have not paid rent. Some landlords will use someone's immigration status against their tenants and threaten to call the immigration authorities. A lot of what I'm seeing is that landlords themselves are immigrants as well, and so which might highlight the need for landlord-tenant training or materials in their language. So there's the challenges to providing legal aid at St. Francis, anyways. It's this fear and inherent distrust of authority. It's the most obvious barrier to providing legal aid is that distrust and fear, which is true for for most Black and Brown communities generally. It's weighing the risk of the illusion of getting immigration called on you or not drawing out a long conflict, which you have to work to dispel, versus that person speaking up for your rights and potentially making a scene, and also making sure that you're not making all the decisions for someone, and you're ensuring that you're acting out the wishes of your client. Another challenge is when you're trying to provide legal aid for people who are risk averse to drawing out conflict, when they would rather just get out of the situation, which is often the best choice for some of our clients. So what are the risks? The risk is the risk of ICE showing up at your door, and detention and deportation and separation of families. Some do not feel like calling the police is the best option for them. Some do not feel comfortable calling the police, and EHOC and St. Francis can, I know they're willing to take those calls if people are not wanting to call the police. And even people who are apprehensive of submitting a CDC declaration form, it's really difficult to kind of, you don't want to persuade someone if they don't want to do it, but you just can just list out what this provides, and they have to make that decision. It's an understanding and intimately knowing our community and clients. And in a lot of situations, the best way to move forward is to mediate and negotiate between the landlord and tenant outside of the courtroom, where most of our clients feel most comfortable, even though they have the right to exert their rights. We trust that our clients know what's best for them as we present all their options. So that's me. And I will stop sharing. Do you want me to just give it to you, Lauren? Yes. So
yes, I will try to share mine, and hopefully it will go smoothly. So like I said at the beginning, my name is Lauren Verseman. I'm an attorney with EHOC. Juan gave a very comprehensive kind of talk about all these different kinds of housing issues that are facing folks. And I know, he mentioned this at the end, that right now in the middle of the pandemic, evictions are on everyone's mind. So, EHOC does all kinds of housing discrimination work, but we've, like many other legal services organizations like CLAM, have started this eviction defense program, trying to work through evictions, and also seeing how fair housing issues, so housing discrimination issues, interface with evictions. So I know we don't have a lot of time. And so I'm going to give you kind of like a really high level talk just for service providers in particular about like, what is like an actual lawful eviction consist of, so that when folks come to you or you're trying to help people navigate things or decide to send them to EHOC or somewhere else, you're like, you even kind of have a good sense of where things are in the process. And so this is a really high level talk, and then I'll talk a little bit about how fair housing connects, okay? So what do we mean when we say eviction? So attorneys, mean one thing. Service providers, renters, advocates may mean something else. And so somebody might come with a letter from the landlord. If you remember a couple slides earlier, right, that big orange piece of paper on the door, a notice to vacate, just a bunch of text messages that say get out. There's all sorts of things that a person might get and think, I'm being evicted. So when someone comes to you with some of those things, the question is like, have they actually been evicted? Well, for an eviction to be lawful, so not all those illegal lockouts Juan was talking about, it has to go through the courts. This applies with people with yearly leases, month-to-month leases, written down leases, just verbal agreements. If you pay rent to someone to live somewhere, you have some kind of lease and that eviction needs to go through the courts. And so a lot of people will think, I don't have a written down lease, I don't have a lease, I don't have rights. That's not true. This actually does apply to people, even if you just have an agreement with a landlord that you're renting from. So nothing else, these threats, these letters, these notices, none of those mean you can actually physically be removed from your house. And so I say this because I think there's a lot of confusion. We have a landlord tenant hotline at EHOC, and people will call and say that they've been evicted. And it's always a process of trying to figure out where we really are. And so these threats, like where a lot of landlords will make a lot of empty threats, a lot of landlords will make not so empty threats. And so just trying to kind of figure out where the situation is. So a real eviction process involves filing a lawsuit, having a hearing, either doing a settlement or getting a judgment. And then if there's a judgment, then the landlord has to ask the sheriff's office to execute that judgment. So it's this multi-step process. It's not a, here's a letter, get out tomorrow. Will landlords do that? Absolutely. But is that a lawful eviction? No. So again, from a service provider standpoint, just people, when you're interacting with folks, that a lawful eviction is this entire process. And so most of you know on some level that we're having an eviction moratorium right now. So how does that process then work with a moratorium? Advocates from EHOC across the country, housing advocates have said, we want those moratoriums to mean no eviction filings, no going to court, none of that. But that is not what we've gotten. What we have in St. Louis City, in St. Louis County, and through the CDC moratorium are a moratorium on that last step of the process. That sheriff coming to your house and actually putting you out. And so when we say eviction moratorium, a lot of eviction related things are still going on. Like Juan talked about the Zoom hearings, right? Like you can actually have an eviction filing and have a court date and get an eviction judgment and have a money judgment against you and finding for the landlord. All of that can still happen. And not only is it still happening, it's still happening via Zoom or via WebEx, where people have not that much access. They may not understand even that they have a court date. I don't feel like I've been to court, to be perfectly honest, right? When I go to Zoom court. So I mean, I can only imagine how people who are trying to understand what they're going through are feeling. So as much as we talk about that moratorium, we have to remember that there are, in fact, reasons that landlords can still file for evictions. And so just like so you have a framework, there's two kinds of evictions. There's rent and possession, so late rent suits, and there's unlawful detainer suits, which are lease violation suits. So people get, withhold rent for repairs, all kinds of things happen, and they fall into these kinds of buckets. I'm not going to go too deep into them, just so you understand there's late rent and there's lease violation types of suits. So what is not on that list? Everything Myisha was talking about, right? Like, it's not because you're a bad tenant for asking for repairs. It's not because there's issues in your housing. Those are not reasons that you are actually allowed to be evicted. But we know that simply not paying your rent almost never reflects everything that's going on in a housing situation, right? It doesn't tell us anything about whether or not the landlord's making repairs. It doesn't tell us anything about that if they're, having even a respectful relationship, or if there's a lease, or it doesn't tell us anything. And from a fair housing standpoint, so from EHOC standpoint in particular, we have this court case that looks like, oh, you didn't pay your rent. But what we also have are these kind of pretext and subtext fair housing issues. So the Fair Housing Act, at the very, very broadest level, prohibits discrimination against protected classes. So race, color, national origin, sex, disability, familial status. So anybody, who belongs to one of those protected classes is covered by the Fair Housing Act for activities that involve housing. So that could be just renting, but that also means terms and conditions, repairs. It can also mean harassment, threats, and even evictions. And so the Fair Housing Act does apply even in the eviction context. So Juan went through a lot of these things, right? Harassment, threatening to report you to ICE, call the police in some way, make you lose your housing, but also just failing to follow through on repairs because you have limited English proficiency and it's a pain for the landlord to deal with it. Those are all things that are violations of the Fair Housing Act. And so although the landlord-tenant law framework doesn't give us that many tools, there are fair housing tools, and that's where an organization, especially like EHOC, can come in and really start to have an additional set of tools for folks that landlord-tenant law doesn't reach. I'm thinking back, to Juan's kind of beginning comments about, how housing interacts with all these different systems of oppression. And if we think about eviction is a state-sanctioned way to take people away from their homes, right? And so landlord-tenant law in a lot of ways, and again, maybe not the position of EHOC as an organization, but when we think about it, it's built in order to help the landlord get people out of their homes. And so when we bring in something like fair housing law, that helps us get another layer of protections for folks that aren't really available in just the straight landlord-tenant law. So what kind of tools do we have? We have fair housing complaints, which is something that EHOC in particular works on. We also have the eviction defense programs that are running now through CLAM, through legal services, through EHOC. We also have the CDC moratorium, which I'm not going to talk about it in great detail, actually, unless we have questions about it. But basically, it is something that applies to across the country to folks who have been trying to pay their rent, have some kind of loss of income, have tried to get government assistance, and have tried to the best of their ability to keep paying their rent. They can hand this declaration to their landlord, and they're not supposed to evict them throughout the end of the year. The city of St. Louis has essentially that same amount of protection without the declaration. So depending on where you're located, you might have that protection already. And the St. Louis County moratorium so far is tied to how far the courts are opening. And so right now the courts are in phase 0. They have to get like 2 more phases before evictions can even start again. So I know that sounds maybe a little bit confusing, but the moratoriums are existing locally and nationally, and they apply to that physical eviction, but not to the court filings. Since we're, again, very low on time, I just want to say also, just for other self-advocacy, EHOC does run a landlord-tenant line, and it does also have a Spanish line, and we can also work with translation services. If people just want to know more about their situation, get more information, we have fact sheets, things that, like, if people just want to understand a little more deeply, we can also help talk people through things, even if we're not directly representing them. So I'm going to go ahead and cut off now because I think there's possibly some questions, but I would also say that EHOC generally loves to collect information about our participants, and it helps us with our reporting. So if I put a link in the chat, I would very much appreciate any of the attendees who would be able to fill that out for us. But I will go ahead and stop sharing, and we will look at the question and answer. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for that wonderful, insightful presentation on housing and immigrants renters crisis. At this time, we do have a few minutes left. If you have any questions, please be sure to put your questions in the chat. Also, Lauren just popped in the link for a sign-in sheet for you all to complete for EHOC. So we do have one question. It says, how are clients referred to your organizations, and who are the main immigrant populations that your organization works with? Also, what have been barriers in reaching out to the immigrant populations least represented by your organization?
I'm not sure if that's specifically EHOC or if that's other organizations, but EHOC, I would say, has a fairly wide range of immigrant populations that we serve, but we find, looking, even preparing for this, that we do not reach as many folks as we would like to. So part of our barriers are that we are almost always reached by phone. We have a hotline and people leave us messages or can do an online complaint. And so there's going to be a little bit of there's going to be a language barrier in that sense. When we call back, we can call back with translation assistance, but we do predominantly a phone interaction. And so that's something that sometimes it's helpful to have another organization who is working with someone who can kind of do that help it with that initial contact, so we can get set up with language services. We've done fair housing complaints this summer for a variety of things, including a Mexican family who neighbors were harassing them about where they were from, to a gentleman from China for some culinary practices. And so there's a really wide range for EHOC. I don't know if Dutchtown or St. Francis would like to also respond.
Yeah, I was just, we also have a phone line. It's, if you have your pen, paper nearby, it's 314-256-5980. But, well, and it's mostly, you leave a message and, so that we can get back to you. And, but honestly, it's just been really through referrals, through kind of like this eviction defense kind of coalition collaborative that we've built since the onset of the pandemic started. There are a number of agencies like EHOC, Legal Services, our City Defenders, and CLAM and St. Francis. We've been collaborating with each other, and also other groups like St. Louis Mutual Aid there've been a ton of referrals from there. And so I think the other question was what other demographic groups. And so mostly I'm bilingual, I speak Spanish. So those are most of my clients. But I mean, the housing program at St. Francis Community Services is really just beginning, and it's in its beginning stages. And so we haven't had as much, as much calls as maybe EHOC has, which is, they're known in this region for what they do. So, and I also see, Myisha, did you have anything to add?
Well, I work with a little bit of everyone that spoke today. The phone calls come in very often through Dutchtown from the immigrant community and others, due to the fact of landlords knowing that they may not have the knowledge of what sustainable housing is and what it takes to advocate for themselves. So I utilize EHOC, I utilize St. Francis, I also utilize the others like Legal Services in Arch City. It is a huge crisis going on right now, and there needs to be more solutions and more money allocated to the housing issues that are arising during this pandemic.